The streets of Washington, D.C. were bustling as the presidential motorcade sped down Pennsylvania Avenue. Secret Service agents flanked the armored Cadillac One, codenamed the Beast, ensuring the safety of the most powerful man in the world, President Donald Trump. It was a routine drive back to the White House after a high-stakes meeting at the Capitol. The world was watching, as always, anticipating his next move in the ever-unpredictable landscape of American politics. Then, something extraordinary happened. Just as the convoy approached an intersection near Franklin Square, a small figure darted onto the road. The brakes screeched, and the entire procession jolted to a sudden halt. A ripple of panic spread among the Secret Service as they quickly surrounded the limousine, their earpieces buzzing with urgent commands. Inside, Trump, slightly startled, peered out through the bulletproof glass. What he saw made him pause. A little girl, no older than 7, stood shivering in the chilly evening air. Her clothes were tattered, her small frame barely visible under an oversized hoodie. She clutched a torn stuffed rabbit in her tiny hands. Her eyes, large and full of sorrow, darted around as if expecting someone to yell at her to move. A homeless child, in the middle of the road. "Sir, we need to keep moving," an agent said firmly. "We can't stop here." But Trump, for all his reputation as a man of strong decisions, did something no one expected. He lifted a hand. "Wait," he said. The agents hesitated. The protocol dictated that the president should never leave the safety of his vehicle unless absolutely necessary. But before they could protest, Trump reached for the door handle and, in a moment that sent shockwaves through the security team, stepped out of the Beast. As the city traffic stood still and cameras from every angle zoomed in, the world watched the President of the United States step onto the pavement toward the homeless girl. The little girl flinched as the towering figure of Trump approached her. He bent slightly, his imposing presence softened by a rare look of concern. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice lower, gentler than the nation was used to hearing. The girl swallowed hard. "I'm Melissa," she whispered. The air was thick with tension. No one had expected this moment, and no one could have predicted what was about to happen next. For a brief moment, silence engulfed the street. The Secret Service, the press corps, and bystanders all stood frozen, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Melissa, the frail homeless girl, stared up at the president, uncertain whether to be afraid or relieved. Her fingers clutched the ear of her worn-out stuffed rabbit. It was the only thing left from a life she could barely remember. Trump kneeled slightly, leveling his gaze with hers. "Melissa, where are your parents?" Her lips trembled as she shook her head. I don't have any." A lump formed in the president's throat. He had spent years making headlines, his policies debated, his tweets dissected, his leadership both praised and criticized. But nothing in his political career had prepared him for this moment. Trump turned to his lead agent. "Get me a coat." "Sir, we should get back inside," the agent replied, his voice tight with concern. "This is a security risk." "I said, get me a coat," Trump repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. One of the security personnel quickly removed his own overcoat and handed it to the president. Without hesitation, Trump draped the heavy fabric over Melissa's frail shoulders. She blinked in surprise at the unexpected warmth. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Trump asked. She shook her head again, biting her lower lip. A nearby journalist, seizing the opportunity, held up his camera. "Mr. President, are you going to take action on homelessness in America? Is this a turning point for your administration?" Trump ignored him. He looked back at Melissa. "When's the last time you ate, sweetheart?" She hesitated, then mumbled, "Yesterday, maybe." That was it. That was the moment when something inside him shifted. Trump stood up, turned to his motorcade, and, to the utter shock of his team, said, "Get this girl in the car." "Sir?" an agent asked, his voice unsure. "You heard me," Trump said firmly. "We're taking her to the White House." The city, the press, and the entire nation watching through their screens collectively gasped. Melissa's eyes widened in disbelief. Really? Trump nodded, offering a rare smile. You're riding with me, kid. And with that, the leader of the free world took the small, trembling hand of a homeless girl and led her into the most secure vehicle on the planet. As the motorcade resumed its journey, the world watched in awe. What had started as a routine drive had now turned into an event that no one would ever forget. But the real shock, it was yet to come. The motorcade sped through Washington, D.C., towards the White House. Inside the presidential limousine, Melissa sat stiffly, her tiny hands gripping the thick coat Trump had given her. She had never been inside a car like this. Leather seats, glowing screens, and security personnel speaking in earpieces. Trump watched her carefully. The hardened businessman turned president had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals, making executive decisions that shaped the country, and standing firm against his critics. But right now, none of that mattered. "Do you like burgers?" he asked casually. Melissa blinked, her hunger overriding her shyness. "Yeah." Trump smirked and turned to one of his aides. "Call the White House kitchen. Tell them we need 2 cheeseburgers and fries. Extra ketchup." Melissa's eyes widened. "You eat cheeseburgers too?" Trump chuckled. "Sweetheart, I've eaten more McDonald's than most people can imagine." For the first time, Melissa smiled. When they arrived at the White House, the security detail was already on high alert. Staff members murmured among themselves, unsure of what was happening. Why had the president brought a homeless child into the heart of American power? As they stepped inside, Trump led Melissa to the dining room. The grand chandeliers shimmered above, and the long mahogany table stretched across the vast space. Melissa's feet hesitated on the marble floor. This was the kind of place she had only seen on TV screens in store windows. Trump pulled out a chair. "Sit," he said. She obeyed cautiously, her small hands resting in her lap. Moments later, a White House butler entered with 2 trays. Steam rose from the freshly prepared cheeseburgers, their scent filling the air. Trump unwrapped his burger and took a bite. "Go ahead," he encouraged, nodding toward her plate. Melissa didn't need another invitation. She grabbed the burger with both hands and took a large bite, her hunger overcoming any hesitation. The warmth of the food was overwhelming. Her stomach hadn't felt this full in a long time. As she chewed, Trump observed her. He had met world leaders, business moguls, and Hollywood stars. Yet, in this moment, sitting across from a 7-year-old girl who had been abandoned by society, something about his perspective shifted. After a few bites, Melissa paused. "Mr. President, why are you helping me?" Trump set his burger down and wiped his hands. His usual bravado softened. "Because I can." She tilted her head. "But no one else does." He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the problem, isn't it?" A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but profound. Trump looked at the Secret Service agent standing by the door. "Get my chief of staff." The agent nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Melissa watched as Trump folded his hands together, his expression shifting into something she couldn't quite read. "Melissa," he said, "how would you like to stay here for a while?" Her eyes darted between him and the grand room around her. "Here," Trump nodded. "We'll get you a room, a warm bed, some new clothes, and we'll figure out what comes next." Tears welled up in Melissa's eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, and the most powerful man in the world had just promised to change her life. But what he did next, that was what would shock the entire world. News of the unprecedented event spread like wildfire. By the time Trump and Melissa finished their meal, every major media outlet was broadcasting the story. Social media exploded with hashtags like #TrumpandMelissa and #TheHomelessGirlInTheWhiteHouse. Pundits speculated on what the president was planning, while critics accused him of a publicity stunt. But Trump didn't care. As Melissa finished her fries, the chief of staff, Mark Meadows, entered the dining hall, looking both confused and intrigued. "Sir, the press is in a frenzy. Everyone wants to know why you've brought this girl here." Trump wiped his mouth with a napkin and leaned back. "Good. Let them talk." Meadows hesitated. "What's the plan here, Mr. President?" Trump glanced at Melissa, who was staring at her stuffed rabbit on the table, the reality of her situation sinking in. Then, he turned back to Meadows and said something that stunned everyone in the room. "I want an emergency session with Congress. Tonight." Meadows' eyes widened. "Sir, that's highly unusual." Trump smirked. "So am I." As the White House staff scrambled to coordinate an impromptu late-night session, Melissa was taken to a guest suite, where aides provided her with clean clothes, warm pajamas, and a cozy bed. She had never slept in such comfort before, and as she lay beneath the thick blankets, she clutched her rabbit and wondered if she was dreaming. Meanwhile, in the Oval Office, Trump sat behind the resolute desk, making calls. By 9 p.m., Congress had gathered. The room buzzed with whispers as senators and representatives speculated about the urgent meeting. Then, the doors swung open, and Trump walked in. Not alone, but with Melissa holding his hand. The room fell silent. The president led her to the front and turned to address the assembly. His voice, firm and commanding, echoed through the chamber. "Tonight, I didn't plan to stop my motorcade," he began. "But I did. And because of that, I met this little girl, Melissa, who, like thousands of other children in America, has been abandoned by a system that's supposed to protect them." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "She doesn't have a home, no family, no food. And yet, we sit here, in the most powerful government in the world, while kids like her sleep on the streets." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others braced for what was coming next. Trump exhaled and continued. "Well, I'm not going to just walk away from this. Tonight, I'm calling for a Homelessness Reform Act, an immediate federal initiative to combat child homelessness in America. And I want Congress to act on it. Now." Gasps filled the room. Journalists watching from the gallery frantically typed on their laptops. This wasn't just a gesture. This was a declaration. Melissa clutched Trump's hand tighter. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. The president looked around the room, his expression unwavering. "You've all got two choices," he said. "You can sit there, argue, and play politics. Or you can do the right thing and help kids like Melissa. The decision is yours." The chamber fell into stunned silence. But the world was about to explode. The chamber was frozen in time. Senators exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. The media, cameras rolling, captured every expression, every reaction. The nation watched in stunned silence as President Trump stood beside a 7-year-old homeless girl, challenging Congress to act. Then, something happened that no one expected. A single voice broke the silence. "I support the president's motion." Heads turned. It was Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. He stood, looking directly at Trump. "Mr. President, you're right. We have ignored this problem for too long. I second your call for the Homelessness Reform Act." A murmur spread. Then, another voice. "I support it too," said Senator Joe Manchin. Then another, and another. Within moments, members from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, began rising to their feet. It was a rare sight in American politics. Unity. Melissa clutched Trump's hand tighter, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. He looked down, winked, and then turned back to the Congress. "Good," he said, smirking. "Now let's get to work." The ripple effect. By morning, the world had changed. News outlets around the globe reported the event as a historic moment in American politics. Social media erupted, with hashtags like #MelissaBill and #TrumpActOnHomelessness trending worldwide. But the most shocking part? It wasn't just talk. Within a record-breaking 48 hours, the Homelessness Reform Act was drafted, fast-tracked, and signed into law. The bill allocated billions in federal funding to provide housing, education, and support for homeless children across America. It wasn't just a temporary fix. It was a structured, long-term plan to eradicate child homelessness. More than that, businesses and billionaires took notice. Donations flooded in. Nonprofits formed partnerships with the government. Shelters expanded. Schools introduced special programs for homeless kids. And at the center of it all, Melissa, the little girl who had stopped a presidential motorcade. The White House lawn was filled with journalists, dignitaries, and children from shelters across the nation. The anniversary of the Homelessness Reform Act was being celebrated, and at the podium stood President Trump. Beside him, wearing a beautiful blue dress and a bright smile, stood Melissa. She wasn't homeless anymore. She wasn't invisible. She had become the face of a movement. Trump looked at the crowd and spoke. America is the greatest country on earth. But we can't call ourselves great if we let our children suffer on the streets. A year ago, a little girl reminded me of something important. We don't turn our backs on our own. He turned to Melissa. And today, I'm proud to say that Melissa is no longer a homeless girl. She's a student, a future leader, and a symbol of what we can do when we choose to act instead of talk. The crowd erupted in applause. Melissa stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady, strong. "Thank you, Mr. President," she said. Then, looking at the audience, she added, "And thank you, America, for believing in kids like me." The applause turned into a standing ovation. And as the cameras captured the moment, the president standing beside the little girl who had changed the nation, one thing was clear. It all started with a single decision to stop. And it had shocked the world.